Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings. The words cut through the first-class cabin like a blade. Every phone came out. Every eye turned to seat 2A to the woman in the plain navy blazer who wasn't moving. She'd been asked for her boarding pass twice. Questioned about how she booked her ticket. Accused in words carefully chosen to leave no fingerprints of carrying forged documents. Now security stood in the aisle. A director was giving orders. A flight attendant whispered to a colleague, just loud enough. The system's been having issues with flagged tickets today. There was no system issue. The woman looked out the window. At the tail of the aircraft, at 2 letters painted there that nobody in that cabin had bothered to read, then she turned, folded her hands, and said 6 words that stopped everything. I'd like to speak with your captain. The check was still on the table somewhere in her future. 8 figures, clean ink. Centered on cream-colored paper the way powerful apologies always are, expense and weightless at the same time. The man across from her had kind eyes, the practiced kind, the kind you develop after 30 years of managing situations instead of solving them. He slid it forward. She didn't look down. Dr. Okafor, his voice was careful, calibrated. We believe this reflects the gravity of keep it. 2 words, flat final, like a door closing on a room nobody wanted to enter anyway. The man blinked. His attorney shifted. Outside the conference room window, Chicago moved without them. Taxis and wind and the gray light of a Tuesday morning that didn't care what had happened to anyone. Dr. Vivian Okafor looked at the man across the table and waited. Then what do you want? He asked. She smiled, just slightly, just enough. 2 hours of your attention, 7 hours earlier. The terminals was doing what terminals always do at that hour. Exhausted, fluorescent, full of people who would rather be somewhere else. Gate 14B, O'Hare International, a hard plastic chair by the window. And Vivian sat in it the way she sat in most places, without announcement, without the accessories that announced. No assistant beside her, no monogrammed luggage, no laptop open to a spreadsheet performing her importance to whoever walked past. Just a woman, 62 years old, navy blazers pressed but not recently, canvas tote from a museum gift shop she'd visited 4 years ago, and a notebook, spiral-bound, the pages soft from use, open in her lap. She was writing, not typing, writing with a pen she'd owned for 11 years. The last one Robert had given her before he got sick and gift-giving became complicated by other priorities. Her handwriting was careful, small. The handwriting of someone who had learned early that space was not always freely given, and so you made the most of what you had. Her phone rang. Isaiah, her son. 28 years old and already worrying like a man twice that age. Mom! His voice was morning root. Boston was 3 times zones away and made him sound farther than he was. You sure you don't want me to fly out with you? Isaiah! I'm just saying, Zeh. The ceremony and the board meeting back to back, that's a lot for one trip. I've been flying alone for 4 years. She kept her voice gentle, because it was him. I think I remember how. I know you do. The particular pause of a child who has become a man and is still learning which worries he's allowed to say out loud. I don't want you to be alone for it. The ceremony. He meant the ceremony. The building in Chicago that was getting a name put on it. Her husband's name, Robert Okafor. Carved in stone at 30 feet high because he had built something that mattered, and the city had decided 4 years too late to say so publicly. She would stand at a podium, she would say the right words. She would not cry until she was back in her hotel room with the door locked. This was the plan. She had made it carefully. I won't be alone, she told Isaiah. How's that? She looked out at the tarmac, at the planes. The unglamorous truth of aviation up close. Fuel trucks, baggage carts, workers in orange vests moving through the cold with the efficiency. See, people who know the job doesn't care how you feel today. I'm never alone in airports, she said. There are always other people with somewhere to be. Isaiah laughed, small, uncertain, the laugh of someone who isn't sure if that was comforting or evasive and suspects it might be both. Call me when you land? I always do. She ended the call, looked back at the notebook, found her place. Kept writing. Around her the gate filled slowly. Business travelers, with the 1,000-yard stare of people who've taken this flight 17 times. A couple arguing quietly about whether they had time for coffee. A man in a suit, standing too close to the charging station, explaining to someone that the numbers hadn't added up for a while. Vivian wrote and breathed, and did not look like a CEO, which was, as it happened, entirely by design. Her husband Robert used to say, and he said it often, in that quiet way he had of repeating the things that mattered most, that real power didn't need a costume. He'd learned that the hard way. The way of certain people in America for expensive lessons, through banks that looked at his business plan and found a feast to say no before they'd finished reading it, through rooms where his handshake was returned too loosely, through the particular performance required of him whenever he walked into a space that had not been built with him in mind. He'd spent years learning to move through those rooms without flinching. And then one day he stopped performing, just stopped, showed up in whatever he'd worn to the office. Supposed to get the speed, he actually thought. Let silences sit without filling them. He'd tried to explain it to Vivian once. Kitchen table, late. After the kids were asleep. He'd just come back from a meeting where someone had called him articulate as a compliment and thought they were being generous. The moment you dress up for their expectations, he said, you've already told them their expectations are the standard, and they're not. Yours are. Vivian had written it down, not in a notebook. On the back of an envelope that was sitting on the counter, she still had the envelope in a box. Third shelf of her home office closet, behind the tax documents, she brought the spiral notebook everywhere instead. Easier to carry. And the people worth talking to never asked her to explain it. They asked what she was writing. The boarding announcement came. First class, business select, premium rewards. The language of contemporary aviation hierarchy delivered in the cheerful tone of someone who has made peace with its adversity. Vivian closed the notebook, slid it into the canvas tote, stood, and stopped. Half a second, the kind of pause as nobody around her would notice. She looked out the window at the plane on the other side of the glass. Wide body, medium haul. The blue and silver livery of Skybridge Airlines, a fictional carrier, not affiliated with any real airline, on the tail, but beneath the livery in a smaller designation font that required knowing what to look for, Call 7 Meridian. She knew that designation the way she knew her own phone number. The way she knew the sounds of Isaiah's laugh when something genuinely surprised him. The way you know the things that cost you something to build. Callaway Okafor Leasing. The subsidiary she'd created 3 years ago. She had named it after Robert's mother's maiden name because she was still 4 years into losing him, looking far small to keep him in the story. Cal 7 was the 7th aircraft they'd placed in the Skybridge fleet. She had signed that contract on a Tuesday in March. In this same city, she looked at the plane for one more second, thought of all the flights, then picked up her tote and walked to the gate. The first-class cabin was what it always was. 4 rows, 8 seats, engineered hush, leather trying very hard, magazines nobody would read. The quality of light that suggested you had made good choices to end up here regardless of what was actually happening in your life. Seat 2A, window, left side. She had chosen it deliberately. She always chose window seats now since Robert, because the sky felt like a direction to look when looking anywhere else got complicated. She settled in, stowed the tote, got out the notebook, and was 4 lines into a note about Thursday's board meeting when she became aware that someone was standing at the edge of her row, not passing through. Standing. She looked up. The flight attendant was around 40, sandy hair pulled back. A face that had been pleasant once and now had the quality of someone who had maintained pleasant for too long at too high a cost. The Skybridge uniform, navy with silver piping, fit her correctly. Name badge, Sandra. Sandra was looking at her with an expression Vivian recognized. Not hostility, something underneath hostility. Something that lived in the space before hostility, that enabled it, that made it possible without ever quite naming itself. The particular quality of not quite seeing that Vivian had encountered in rooms and airports and boardrooms and restaurants across 4 decades. The look that said, you don't match the image I carry in my head for what belongs here. It wasn't new.
It was never new.
Excuse me, ma'am. Sandra's voice was professionally calibrated, not unkind, which almost made it worse. Can I see your boarding pass? Vivian looked at her for a moment, then reached into the tote. Found the boarding pass, printed, not digital, because she preferred paper for the same reason she preferred notebooks. Paper didn't need battery, couldn't be remotely wiped. She handed it over. Sandra took it, looked at it, looked at Vivian, looked at the boarding pass again, the micropause, the calculation. The moment where the information on the paper collided with the assumption in the head and the assumption found a way to survive contact with evidence. Just one moment, Sandra said, turned. Walked 2 steps toward the galley and leaned toward her colleague, a younger man restocking the drink cart, at a volume not quite private, Marcus. Can you double-check this one? The system's having issues with flagged tickets today. The words were reasonable, professional, defensible in a report. The look on her face while she said them was not. Marcus glanced at the boarding pass, glanced at Vivian, looked faintly uncomfortable in the way of someone who doesn't have the seniority to say what they actually think.
Looks fine to me.
Sandra, just flagging the system anyway.
And she moved on.
Not removed, not confronted directly, just flagged. The small bureaucratic instrument of doubt deployed precisely where it would do the most damage without leaving fingerprints. Vivian turned back to her window. The gray morning outside, the tarmac, the fuel trucks, the workers in orange vests moving through a cold that didn't care how anyone felt about it. She opened her notebook, found her place, kept writing, the cabin filled around her. Seat 1C. A man who arrived the way certain men always arrived in first class, as though the seat had been expecting him mid-60s. Silver hair, good suit, the posture of someone accustomed to people moving aside before being asked. His name was Reginald Ashford, retired from banking. The kind of banking that moved money in amounts with 5 or 6 zeros and called the process due diligence when it was really something and less precise. He didn't look at Vivian when he sat down. The angle was wrong, and looking wasn't something he'd needed to do in most rooms. Seat 1D, an older woman, early 70s, moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to trust her body less than she once had. White hair. A coat expensive in a way that was 20 years old and had been maintained rather than replaced. She sat, arranged her things, and looked around the cabin with the expression of someone conducting an inventory. Her gaze landed on Vivian. Held there for a moment, moved on. Her name was Harriet Dunmore. Her husband had flown for Skybridge's predecessor airline for 38 years. She understood this industry at the molecular level, understood it well enough to know before anything had been said that something in this cabin was already slightly off. The way you know a note is wrong even before you can name the key. She looked her lap, didn't say anything. Seat 3B, a younger woman, early 30s, dark hair, practical clothes. The efficiency of someone moving between two deadlines, a small notebook of her own, fresh, with a pen tucked in the spiral. The notebook of someone who took notes professionally, not personally. Her name was Catalina Voss. She wrote for 2 publications, one about transportation infrastructure, one about civil rights law as it intersected with public accommodations. She had been working on a piece about discrimination in commercial aviation for 7 months. 3 good sources, no case study with enough documentation to make it undeniable. She sat down, looked around, felt the specific alertness of a reporter who walks into a room and recognizes that something is already in motion. She didn't take her notebook out yet. She watched. Seat 4C, a man who moved like someone comfortable in his own size. 59, broad-shouldered, the deliberate physicality of someone who had learned to occupy exactly the space he was entitled to without apology. Paperback novel, reading glasses he hadn't entirely made peace with. His name was Professor Noel Abernathy. Civil rights law, 22 years at a university whose name opened doors, mentioned only when strategically useful. He had testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. He had argued cases that became footnotes in other people's arguments. He noticed Vivian immediately, not because he knew who she was, because Cassandra had moved away from seat 2A. The angle of it. The trajectory of someone performing official concern while motivated by something else. He'd seen that trajectory before. Many times. From the other side, he opened his book. Didn't read. Sandra came back through the cabin 12 minutes before departure, doing pre-departure checks. She stopped at 2A. Ma'am, can I ask, did you book this ticket direct through our website or through a third-party service? Vivian looked up from the notebook. Unhurried. Directly, she said. And this is your first time flying Skybridge? No, the smallest pause. Catalina Voss wrote something. 1 line, quick! We've had some issues recently with certain booking platforms, Sandra said. It's just standard procedure to verify. Vivian looked at her. A long, quiet moment. You've already verified my boarding pass. Twice, sis? Yes, ma'am, I understand. This is just standard procedure. Right, another pause. Of course, Vivian said, and turned back to the window. Sandra moved on, but she pulled out her phone, not to call anyone. Just held it the way people hold phones when they're constructing a version of events. When they want a record that looks like something other than what it is. From Forsey at Sanathy set us down his book. He didn't say anything yet. He was a patient man. He'd learned that timing mattered in courtrooms and in cabins, and that the first person to speak was not always the most useful one. He closed the book and he waited. Owen Bassett appeared at the front of the cabin, Director of Passenger Operations. His badge said that. His bearing said he was very, very comfortable wielding the title in enclosed spaces. He was 53. Not unkind. The kind of not unkind that had become procedural, managed and calibrated rather than felt. He had spent 20 years making decisions he described as operational rather than moral, which is a distinction that is very useful for a certain kind of career and very hard to maintain when the room gets small enough. Sandra moved to him quietly, said something close to his ear. He glanced at seat 2A, did a calculation, and came forward. Ma'am, He stood at the edge of the row. I'm Owen Bassett, Director of Passenger Operations. I apologize for the inconvenience, but we've had some reports to ticketing irregularities on this route, and we're doing additional verification on certain bookings. Vivian closed her notebook, slowly, deliberately, the way you close something when you want to mark the moment. What kind of irregularities? She asked. Booking discrepancies, forged documentation in some cases. He said it clinically, the way you say the damaging thing when you've practiced saying it without your hands moving. I want to assure you this is standard across all affected seats. Which other seats are being verified? A pause. Ma'am, you said certain bookings, plural. Which other passengers in this cabin are you asking to verify their documentation? Bassett's jaw moved slightly. That's an excellent question. Everybody looked. Abernathy had not raised his voice. He never needed to. 22 years in front of various judicial bodies had given him a register that simply carried further than other people's. Professor, Bassett said, please stay out of. I'm not in anything, Abernathy said pleasantly. I'm asking the same question the lady asked. Which seats are being verified? I'd like to know if mine is on the list. Sir, because I saw her boarding pass when she came down the jetway. Seat 2A, first class, valid, standard. And I've been sitting here for 10 minutes watching airline staff manufacture reasons to question it. He turned a page in his closed book, so I'd like to understand the irregularity. The cabin had gone quiet. The specific quiet of people who have been watching something and have suddenly understood what they've been watching. Harriet Dunmore was looking at her lap. Reginald Ashford was looking at his phone. His expression had the quality of someone trying to decide which direction to look and finding all of them complicated. Catalina Voss was writing, steadily, without looking up. Sir Bassett said, I'm going to need you to let us handle this. I'm not stopping you from handling anything. I'm documenting the conversation. Abernathy looked up directly at Bassett. Should I not be? Officer Darnell Price arrived through the door. Airport security. 44 years old. He moved the way men move when they've been called to a situation they've already assessed from the description and are now reassessing based on what they can see in the room. He came in, looked at Bassett, looked at Vivian, looked at the gap between those two things, and stopped. He'd been called for a passenger removal, standard language. He'd responded to it probably 200 times. But the passenger in question was sitting with her hands in her lap, her spine straight, her notebook on the tray table. She had not moved because she had decided not to move, which was categorically and legally different from refusing to comply. Sir, Price said carefully, what's the situation? Passenger verification issue. We may need her to deplane. Has she been given written notification of the irregularity? Has she been offered the standard passenger dispute form? Bassett looked at him with the expression of a man who has just realized the backup he called is not going to function as backup. That's not the protocol for. It is the protocol, Price said. Section 4. 2 of the Passenger Service Manual. I've had to explain it in situations like this before. Silence. From 4C, Abernathy made a small sound, not quite a laugh, the sound of a man who's just gained a favorable witness. Price looked at Vivian, directly, professionally. With the specific carefulness of someone who knew their carefulness was always being evaluated. Ma'am, are you comfortable? Is there anything you need? Vivian looked at him. Something passed between them, the recognition of two people who understood what it cost to ask that question in exactly this room. I'm fine, officer, she said. Thank you for asking. Price nodded, turned back to Bassett, and waited. Bassett opened his mouth, closed it. The room was not moving in the direction he had expected the room to move. Ma'am, he said, given the circumstances and the need to maintain our departure schedule, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, not at his badge, not at his title, at him, at the specific human being who had just said the words, and then she looked past him, out the window, at the tail of the plane, Cal 7 Meridian. She looked at it the way you look at something that is yours, not with pride or performance, just with the quiet, factual recognition of ownership, of authorship, of having put a thing into the world and knowing it. Mr. Bassett, she said. Quiet, certain. The certainty of someone who has because she had never had any doubt underneath. I would like to speak with Captain Whitfield. The captain doesn't handle passenger. He will handle this one. Bassett walked to the cockpit. The cabin held its breath. Not dramatically. People don't hold their breath dramatically in real life. They just go quiet in the particular way of a group that has collectively understood that something important is being decided and that none of them are doing the deciding. Catalina Voss finished a sentence, turned to a new page. Abernathy had put his book away entirely. He was watching the front of the cabin with the patient attention of a man who knew what was coming and was already thinking past it. Reginald Ashford had lowered his phone to his lap. He was looking at the window, at the tail of the plane visible beyond the wingtip, squinting slightly at the designation in smaller font beneath the livery. Call 7 Meridian. He had seen those letters before. In a boardroom, on a slide. In the acquisition font that made large numbers look like routine line items. He had skimmed the executive summary, signed off because the due diligence team had already processed everything that needed processing. He looked at the back of the woman's head in 2A, at the navy blazer, the canvas tote, the spiral notebook still on the tray table. No, he thought, that can't be right, except it was. He knew it was. He had known it for the last 90 seconds in the way you know things you would very much prefer not to know. Completely. And with no remaining room for renegotiation, and with the specific sinking quality of a man watching the conclusion of his own assumptions arrive. He looked back at the window, didn't pick up his phone. In 1D, Harriet Dunbar had finally looked up, not at Bassett's empty path toward the cockpit, at his seat 2A, at the back of Vivian's head, at the blazer that had been pressed but not recently, at the canvas tote that no one would mistake for a status symbol. Her hands were still in her lap. Still. The stillness of someone who had been sitting with a specific knowledge for 15 minutes and had not yet decided what to do with it. She knew something was wrong, had known it from the first exchange. The specific wrongness of it had a shape she recognized, not because she had experienced it herself, but because she had been in rooms where it happened to other people and said nothing, and then driven home and managed not to think about it. She looked at her hands, said nothing, and felt the weight of that. The cockpit door opened. Captain Jerome Whitfield was 61 years old, 33 years of flying. The face of a man shaped by altitude and weather and the accumulated weight of managing large machines and the human chaos that collected in closed spaces at 35,000 feet. He came down the aisle without hurrying. He never hurried. That was one of the things 3 decades of aviation did to you. It calibrated your pace to the speed of considered decisions, because hurrying in a cockpit had consequences that permanently reorganized your relationship with speed. He moved through the cabin the way experienced captains do, scanning, reading, not just the physical space, but the temperature of it, the quality of what was in his air. His eyes found seat 2A. He looked at Vivian, and he went still. Not recognition, not exactly. He didn't know her face, didn't know her name. But he knew something. The way some people know things not from data, but from the accumulated archive of their own experience. From having been, themselves, the person in the room that the room kept trying to make smaller. He had been to first officer at 29. Had walked into a captain's briefing at 34 and had the senior officer address all his questions to the white co-pilot. He had learned over 3 decades to recognize a specific kind of situation from a specific kind of distance. The woman in 2A had her spine straight and her hands in her lap and her notebook on the tray table. She was watching him with the calm of someone who had occupied rooms far more difficult than this one. She had not performed distress, had not escalated or dissolved, had simply asked the kind for the captain, and then she had waited. He reached the front of the cabin, looked at Bassett, at Sandra, at Price, at the forest of expressions that told him everything he needed to know about what had happened here before he arrived. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm Captain Jerome Whitfield. I understand there's been a question about your documentation." "Captain Whitfield." Her voice was level. "I've been asked to verify my boarding pass twice. I've been questioned about my booking method, and I've been told I may need to deplane for additional verification." Whitfield looked at Bassett. Bassett shifted his weight. The concern was about potential booking irregularities. Bassett began. "Has anyone else in this cabin been asked to verify their booking method?" Whitfield said. A pause. "The situation was flagged by Owen. The level says someone who does not need to raise his voice. Has anyone else in this cabin been asked to verify their booking method?" Silence, which was its own answer. Whitfield looked at Vivian for a moment, the blazer, the canvas tote, the face of a woman who had been traveling alone for 4 years and was still doing it with her spine straight. Something he recognized, something he had seen in the mirror. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you affiliated with Callaway Okafor Leasing?" The cabin barely breathed. Vivian looked at him, and something's changed in her eyes, not surprise. Something quieter. The recognition of someone who has finally been seen, not her title, not her assets, not her contract value, just seen. "I'm the founder," she said. 3 seconds of absolute silence. Then, from 1C, a sound, small, involuntary. Reginald Ashford, who had been looking at the window, who had been very carefully maintaining a posture of lateral non-involvement since his putting phone face down. He set it on the armrest, slowly, the way you put something down when you've realized you should have put it down 20 minutes ago. He looked at the badge on Vivian's blazer, the small pin on the lapel, gold on black. The Okafor aviation certain insignia which he had seen on a slide deck in a boardroom that was probably in this same city at this same kind of glass and steel table. His face did something complicated, and he said very quietly to no one in particular, "Oh no." Whitfield turned to Owen Bassett. He did not say, "Do you understand what you've done?" He was not that kind of man. He said, with the precision of someone choosing each word surgically, "Owen, I'm going to need you to step back. Captain, if we could just step back." Bassett stepped back, and Sandra Pruitt by the galley, who had started all of this with a perfectly calibrated question about a boarding pass, felt something change in the air. Something before weather, a pressure shift, a different quality of light. She lowered her phone, slowly. Outside the window, the gray morning had shifted into something harder to name, not quite white. The sky of a city's deciding what a day it was going to be. The passengers of this flight waited. And Captain Jerome Whitfield, who had been flying for 33 years, and who had once been asked to step aside for a passenger who couldn't accept what he was, looked at the woman in seat 2A. "Dr. Okafor," he said quietly, "I have some calls to make. I need a few minutes to pull documentation on this aircraft's registration and contract history." "Take the time you need, Captain," Vivian said. He held her gaze for a moment. The specific gaze of two people who understood the same thing about the same world without needing to explain it to each other. Then he turned and walked back toward the cockpit. The door closed, and the cabin sat with itself, with the thing it had done and the thing it hadn't done, and the distance between those two things which was beginning to feel very large. Vivian set down her pen, not dramatically. She just set it in the crease of the notebook, the way you do when you've finished a thought and are about to move to a different kind of thinking. She looked at the window, at the tail, Cal 7 Meridian. Robert's name in the holding structure, the machine sitting on the ground in the gray morning, waiting to do the thing it was built to do. She had a specific memory of the day they named it. Not a ceremony. Robert had refused a ceremony, called it embarrassing, said if she threw a party for a leasing subsidiary, he was going to pretend he didn't know her at the airport. So she had named it on a Tuesday afternoon with her attorney present, and Robert on a video call from the hospital where he was doing what he was doing in those months, which was differently than he ever had before. She had held up the incorporation document to the camera so he could see the name. He had smiled, the real one. The one that only happened in small rooms. "Call," he'd said. "My mother's name in an acronym. She would have hated that." "She would have loved it," Vivian said. She would have pretended to hate it and told everyone at church. They had both laughed. And it was the last time that particular kind of laugh happened. The easy kind, the unburdened kind, the kind that didn't yet know what was coming in the next 14 months. She looked at the tail of the plane, thought about that laugh, then opened her notebook to a clean page and began to write. Not a proposal, not a note. Just words, the way she wrote when she needed to think in a direction she hadn't been in before. 3 rows back, Catalina Voss had stopped writing and was reading what she'd written. 1 row up, Harriet Dunmore had not moved. Her hands were still in her lap. Her eyes were on the back of the seat in front of her, but something up her posture had shifted, the micro-adjustment of someone who has reached a conclusion they haven't yet decided to act on. Reginald Ashford was not looking at his phone, not looking at the window. He was looking at the floor between the rows, the carpeted aisle, with the expression of a man in the middle of a private accounting he hadn't been expecting to do today. And Sandra Pruitt was in the galley, not visible, but present in the way people are present when they haven't gone anywhere but are hoping the room forgets that. The cockpit door opened. Whitfield came back through it. His expression was different from when he'd left. Not shocked, not frightened. Something more calibrated than either of those things. The expression of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected and is now moving through the implications with the same systematic precision he brought to everything. He had his tablet. He was reading something on it as he walked. He reached the front of the cabin. Stopped. "Dr. Okafor," he said, "I pulled the aircraft manifest from our operations system, Sail 7 Meridian, Callaway Okafor Leasing. Active contract with Skybridge Airlines commenced 18 months ago." He held up the tablet briefly. "Not for the room, for her. Your company's contract is in the documentation I agreed to fly under this morning." Sandra Pruitt, in the galley, made a sound. Very small, involuntary, the sound of someone stepping off what they thought was solid ground. Additionally, Whitfield continued, our operations system flagged a shareholder notation in the Skybridge corporate registry. Okafor Aviation Partners holds a significant equity position in Skybridge's parent company, Consolidated Air Holdings. He looked at Bassett, not unkindly, but without ambiguity, which means the passenger whose documentation you have been questioning is, in several meaningful senses, among the beneficial owners of the company you represent. Owen Bassett said nothing, because there was nothing available to say. From 1CC, Reginald Ashford stood up, not like a man making a speech, like a man who has reached a conclusion and is acting on it before he can find a reason not to. Captain, he cleared his throat. I need to say something. Whitfield looked at him. I was recording earlier, when this began. Ashford didn't look at the back of seat 2A when he said the next part. He looked at the middle of the aisle, where the accounting was happening. I wasn't recording to protect her. I was recording because I had already decided she didn't belong here, and I wanted documentation of why she was being removed. The cabin absorbed this. I've spent 40 years in banking, he continued. Private capital, institutional lending, acquisition finance. I have sat across tables from people who built real things, companies, infrastructure, entire industries, and I have found reasons to decline, because something about the picture didn't match the image in my head. I called it due diligence, pattern recognition, risk assessment. He paused. It wasn't only that, he said, and I have never said that out loud to anyone, including myself. Vivian turned in her seat, looked at him directly for the first time. Mr. Ashford, she said. Sit down, he blinked. We're going to talk, but not yet. Sit down. He sat, without protest, the sit of a man who has just been told something true by someone who earned the right to say it. Vivian turned back, to face forward. Captain Whitfield, she said. I need a few minutes. He understood immediately. The understanding of someone who has also, at various points, need a few minutes and has not always been given them. Of course, he said. She picked up her notebook and her tote, stood, moved past Bassett, who stepped aside, past Sandra, who did not look at her, down the aisle toward the rear of the aircraft. The lavatory door closed behind her, and the cabin sat in the quiet of what had just happened. In the specific quality of silence that falls over a room when the thing that was building for a long time has finally arrived, and everyone is still deciding what they are now that it has. Harriet Dunmore looked at her hands. Catalina Voss wrote one more line and closed her notebook. Reginald Ashford looked at the floor, and Officer Cardinal Price stood near the front, weight-balanced, waiting. The posture of someone who had been in this kind of quiet before and knew it required presence more than action. Just being there. Just making sure the quiet held until something better came in to replace it. The door to the lavatory did not open for 3 full minutes. When it did, Vivian came through it the way she had come through every door in her professional, as though she had decided on the other sides of it exactly what she was going to do next. Spine straight, notebook in her hand, eyes forward. She walked back to seat 2A and sat down. Placed the notebook on the tray table. Looked at Captain Whitfield. Captain, she said, I'd like to speak with Director Marsh. And Whitfield nodded, once. Reached for his phone, and the next part of it began. 3 minutes. That was how long the door stayed closed. Not long. Except when you're sitting in a pressurized metal tube waiting for the person who just reorganized your understanding of a situation to come back out of a 4x66 lavatory and tell you what happens next. Then 3 minutes is a very specific kind of long. Vivian stood at the sink. The lavatory of a commercial aircraft is not a generous space, functional, efficient. The smell of recycled air and industrial soap that no number of tiny complementary products ever quite addresses. A mirror that shows you exactly what you look like without the framing devices that hotel mirrors and office bathrooms use to make the image kinder. She looked at herself. 62 years old, navy blazer. Hair she'd stopped processing 3 years ago because Robert had asked her once, gently, just once, why she spent money on it, and she hadn't had an answer that wasn't about other people's comfort. She looked at herself the way she looked at things that required honest assessment. Without flinching, without performing anything for anyone, without the particular compression that happened when other people were watching, and the watching changed what you were allowed to feel. Her hands were on the edge of the sink. She checked them, not shaking. She was both grateful for this and aware that it was its own kind of grief. The thing that happens when you've absorbed enough over enough years that even your hands have learned to hold still regardless of what's happening inside them. She opened the notebook, not to write, to a specific page. The corner worn soft from being turned to often enough that the paper had taken the shape of her particular grip. Robert's handwriting, Tuesday. The worst year, the year of the ninth rejection, when no had started to feel like weather rather than decision. Like something that simply happened to you rather than something humans chose to do. They see what they expect. We build what they can't imagine. She'd read those words more times than she could count. She read them now. In a 4x6 lavatory at 30 feet of altitude, the engine's not yet running, a cabin full of people outside this door who were sitting with something they hadn't finished processing. She thought about the kitchen table, the midnight, the coffee going cold. Robert's voice, not angry, never angry about this, just clear in the way he was clear about things that had cost him enough to understand completely. She thought about Sandra Pruitt, the expression on her face when she'd held up that boarding pass. Not cruelty with a plan. Not malice that had decided on a target, just assumption, seamless, invisible to itself. The particular confidence of someone who had moved through the world with a picture in her head of what belonged where, and when the picture didn't match the reality, found the reality suspicious rather than the picture. That was the thing that had always been the thing. Not the people who decided to be cruel, the people who never decided anything at all, who just acted from pictures they'd never examined, with professional voices and procedural language and the genuine belief that they were doing their jobs. Vivian closed the notebook, looked at herself one more time. 62 years old, 4 years without Robert. A building in Chicago getting his carved on it this afternoon. A cabin full of people outside this door who were going to have to sit with what they'd done and what they hadn't done and the distance between those two things. She straightened her blazer. Not for them. For herself. The way you do something when you've decided what you're going to do next, and the decision requires a physical preparation. Opened the door, walked back to 2A, sat down, placed the notebook on the tray table, looked at Whitfield. "Captain," she said, "I'd like to speak with Director Marsh." Whitfield made the call, standing 2 steps from the cockpit door. Semi-private, neither of them expected true privacy. The cabin was 8 seats, and everyone who mattered in those seats had already demonstrated they were paying close attention. He spoke quietly, listened, spoke again. His expression did not change dramatically during the call, which was the expression of a man who had learned to keep his face professionally neutral in situations that were not professionally neutral at all. But his shoulders, just slightly, came down from where they'd been holding since he'd walked out of the cockpits and seen the room. He ended the call, walked back to the front of the cabin. "Director Marsh will be on in 45 seconds, he said. He's asking for speaker." "No," Vivian said. "It's not speaker. Not yet." Whitfield handed her the phone. She held it. The cabin did not pretend not to be listening. There was no longer any pretense of that. Catalina Voss had her notebook open again. Abernathy was watching with the stillness of a man recognizing the architecture of something he'd spent his career studying. Reginald Ashford had his hands clasped on his knees. Harriet Dunmore had finally looked up from her lap entirely. The phone connected. Dr. Okafor. Director Alan Marsh's voice carried the quality of a man who had been briefed in the last 90 seconds and was navigating somewhere between controlled alarm and studied deference. "On behalf of Skybridges Airlines, I want to offer our most, Mr. Marsh." She said it without heat, just redirection. "I'm going to tell you what happened. I'd like you to listen before you respond." A pause. "Of course," she told him clearly, chronologically. Without embellishment, and without emotional language, and without anything except the specific sequence of events in the order they had occurred. The first request to verify her boarding pass. The second, the audible comment to the colleague about flagging it. The director's arrival and his language about booking irregularities and forged documentation. The instruction to deplane. The way the escalation had been constructed. Each step individually defensible, the cumulative direction of them not. She spoke for 2 minutes and 50 seconds. "Stopped!" Marsh's voice, when it came back, was quiet in the specific way of someone who has just understood the full scope of a problem and is choosing his next words with the knowledge that they will be quoted. "Dr. Okafor, I want to direct with you. What you've described is completely unacceptable. I am personally... Marsh, I don't want personal apologies yet. I want to understand what you're prepared to do." A longer pause, the pause of a man recalibrating from script to specifics. "Whatever you need," he said. "We are fully committed to." "That's not specific enough." Silence. "Tell me what specific steps you are prepared to take in the next 48 hours, Vivian said. "Concrete steps. With timelines and accountable parties." From 4cc, Abernathy made a small sound. Not quite approval. The sound of a man watching someone use the right instrument for the job. What followed was 6 minutes. 6 minutes of the kind of negotiation that doesn't look like negotiation because it isn't loud or theatrical. It's precise. The precision of a woman who had been in enough rooms where the jet terms mattered to know exactly how to choose them and exactly how to hold the other person to the ones they'd said out loud. First, the verification procedure applied to her that morning would be documented in full and submitted to Skybridge's legal department by end of business that day. Second, the flight would depart as soon as Captain Whitfield confirmed the crew was ready. No further delay to this aircraft or these passengers. Third, within 48 hours, Skybridge would provide a written proposal addressing systemic changes to the passenger verification protocol, requiring supervisor authorization before any passenger could be asked to provide documentations beyond the initial boarding pass check, requiring written documentation of the stated reason, requiring consistent application of the same standard across all passengers in the affected cabin. And one more thing, Vivian said. Marsh waited. Sandra Pruitt keeps her job. The cabin shifted. Everyone who had been pretending to look somewhere else stopped pretending. Bassett looked up sharply. Sandra, visible now at the edge of the galley, had gone very still. Dr. Okafor, Marsh said slowly, given what you've described, the airline would fully support whatever outcome you. I know what the airline would support, Vivian said. I'm telling you what I want. She keeps her job on the condition that she completes a substantive bias recognition program. Not a module, not 40 minutes this online with quiz at the end. In-person training with qualified instructors. Real time in a room with the material, and that she does it within 60 days. Silence on the line. Done, Marsh said. I'll have my team follow up with yours on the specifics of the training program, Vivian said. And I want the protocol revisions shared with Okafor Aviation Partners as part of our ongoing contractual relationship. Quarterly compliance reporting going forward. Agreed. She ended the call, handed the phone back to Whitfield, looked at Owen Bassett. Mr. Bassett, she said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to take it seriously. He looked at her. At what point did this situation stop being about a boarding pass? Bassett's jaw moved, processing, calibrating the available responses. Because it stopped very quickly, Vivian said, and I don't think it was ever about a boarding pass. I think a boarding pass was the instrument. The situation was something else, and I think you know what that something else was. The cabin was absolutely still. Bassett looked at the floor. A long moment. The kind of moment that requires deciding whether to protect the version of events you arrived with or to put it down. Yes, he said finally. One syllable. Quiet. But present. The sound of something that cost something. That's where we start, Vivian said. Field returned to the front of the cabin. He had his tablet again. Something about his posture was different from when he'd first come down the aisle. The professional neutral was still there. That never left. 33 years had made it structural. But underneath it, something had loosened. The particular loosening of a man who has stopped managing a situation and started being honest about it. Dr. Okafor, he said, before I go back to the cockpit, I want to say something. The cabin waited. 30, he said. I was a first officer. Domestic route. A passenger refused to fly if I was in the cockpit. Said he wanted a real pilot. He said it plainly, without drama. The way you say the things you have carried long enough to have made some peace with, not because they stopped mattering, but because you found a way to hold them while still moving. The airline asked me to step aside. Vivian looked at him. Did you? She asked. I did, because I needed the job. A beat. And now? She asked. Whitfield held her gaze. His eyes were 61 years of specific history. Now I'm the captain, he said, and I decide who deplanes. He turned and walked back to the cockpit. The door closed. And the sound of the engines beginning their pre-departure sequence came up through the floor, the low building hum of systems coming online, of a machine preparing to do the thing it was built for. Sandra Pruitt walked out of the galley, all the way out, into the cabin. Forward! She did it without the cart, without a professional reason. Just walked forward the way you walk toward something you've decided to face before you have time to talk yourself back into the galley. She stood in the aisle, a few feet from seat 2A, hands at her sides. Uniform still pressed. Badge still reading Sandra, still the flight attendant. Just also now something else. Someone in the middle of an understanding that had arrived at the worst possible time and in the most documented possible way. She looked at Vivian. Dr. Okafor? Her voice was not the professionally calibrated voice from before. That voice had run out of fuel somewhere around the moment that the words said they'll contract and shareholder. This voice was just hers, careful in a different way. The careful of someone trying not to say another wrong thing when they've just finished counting up the wrong things they've already said. I need to ask you something, Vivian waited. Did you know the whole time? From when I first came to your row? Sandra paused. Did you know who you were? What your company was? What this pest was? Yes. Then why didn't you just tell us? The cabin was absolutely still. Vivian looked at her for a long moment, and here was the thing. The thing that nobody in that cabin had been expecting. Not Abernathy with his closed book, not Catalina with her pen, not Ashford with his hands clasped on his knees. Vivian's voice when it came was not angry, was not cold, was not the voice of someone delivering a verdict. It was just true, because I shouldn't have to. Sandra absorbed this. I was in my seat, Vivian continued, with a valid ticket, on a plane that my company leases to your airline. I should not need to produce evidence of my net worth or my corporate holdings or the name on the tail of the aircraft in order to sit in a seat I paid for. Silence us. The question isn't, that's why I didn't tell you who I was, Vivian said. The question is what you would have done if I was nobody. She's let that sit if I was just a woman. 62 years old, traveling alone, with a valid ticket in a window seat and nowhere extraordinary to be. What would you have done, Sandra? It wasn't a question. Sandra stood with it, the mirror. The particular discomfort of seeing yourself in something you cannot argue with because the image is too accurate. I don't know, Sandra said, and this was the first true thing she had said in the last 40 minutes. Not procedural, not defensive. Just honest, small and honest, and more revealing than anything that had come before it. I don't know what I would have done, and that's the worst part. Yes, Vivian said, it is a long pause. I didn't think I was doing something wrong, Sandra said, when I first came to your row. I genuinely didn't think. She stopped, started again. I've been doing this job for 13 years, and I've told myself I was good at it. You probably are good at parts of it, Vivian said, but not this part, not this part. Sandra looked at her, the look of someone receiving something they didn't ask for and recognize as necessary. The training you told Director Marsh about, she said. The real training, in a room, with instructors. Yes, I want to be there. Not because I have to be. Because. She stopped, found the real reason, the one underneath the first answer she'd reached for. Because I don't want to be the person who did this and then went home and told herself a different story about what happened until the story fit. Vivian was quiet for a moment. That sentence, she said, is the most important thing you've said today. Is that a yes? It's a yes. Sandra exhaled, long and slow, the exhale of someone who had expected no and needed a moment to adjust to its absence. She nodded, once, small, the nod of a promise made in front of witnesses, and went back to the galley. Officer Darnell Price stepped forward. He'd been standing near the front of the cabin through all of it. Present, watchful, the posture of someone whose job was to hold the space steady while things moved inside it. Dr. Okafor, he said. I want to say something before I have to go. His departure window was closing. His jurisdiction ended at the gate. The plane was preparing to push back. I knew the procedure was off, he said. From when I came in, I saw the situation and I knew it didn't add up, and I pushed back on the documentation question. He paused, but I didn't push back harder, and I should have. Why didn't you? Abernathy asked from 4C, not accusatory. The genuine question of a man who taught people to understand the Simpsons, understand the people is inside them. Price looked at him. Same reason as most people in this cabin, he said. I didn't want the trouble. Another pause, and then the addition that cost something to say, which is its own kind of trouble. When you think about the trouble I was avoiding and the kind I was making by avoiding it. Abernathy nodded slowly. That's a sentence worth writing down, he said. Not to Price specifically, to the room in general. Catalina Voss was already writing it. Price looked at Vivian one more time. What you said to Director Marsh, he said. About Sandra keeping her job, I've never seen that before. Someone in your position after something like this?
Sorry, I've never seen that.
Have you seen, Vivian? Asked. Lawsuits, press statements. The airline sign comes out, says the right words. The employee disappears. And 6 months later, someone else in a different uniform does the same thing to a different person in a different seat because nothing actually changed. Just the name on the paperwork. Vivian looked at him. Exactly, she said. Price held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the specific nod of some who has understood something that will stay with them. Safe flight, Dr. Okafor, he said. He moved toward the boarding door, paused at the threshold. For what it's worth, he said, to no one in particular, to everyone in general. I've been in this job 11 years. Today is the first time I've ever seen a room actually look at itself. He left, the boarding door closed, and the cabin was sealed. The 8 seats and the people in them and the thing that had happened between them. No more egress, sax mercegress, just the plane and the runway and wherever they were all going. Reginald Ashford stood up again. This time, not like a man making a decision. Like a man completing one he'd already started 20 minutes ago when he put his phone face down on the armrest. Dr. Okafor. Vivian looked at him. I said earlier that I was recording to document her removal. That was true. He didn't look away with Satan, he says the next part. What I didn't sit and say was that I also pulled out my phone because some part of me wanted confirmation that I was right, that what I had already decided about the situation was correct. He paused. That's different from what I said, and I think you know it's different. Yes, Vivian said. I do. Been in 40 years of boardrooms, private capital, institutional lending, and I have stood in front of rooms and said things like, we follow the numbers. We apply the same criteria to every applicant. The process is neutral, and I believed it. Or I told myself I believed it. He looked at the middle of the aisle again, where the accounting was. The criteria weren't neutral. I wrote some of them, and I wrote them the way people write things when they've never had to think about what it costs to not fit the model. Harriet Dunmore in 1D was listening with the quality of someone doing two things at once, hearing what Ashford was saying and having a parallel conversation with herself about something adjacent. I've never said any of that out loud, Ashford continued, to a colleague, to a client, to myself at any kind of volume. I've spent 40 years being very comfortable with the distance between what I said the process was and what the process actually did. He looked at Vivian directly. How do you not? He stopped, restarted. Why are you willing to talk to me right now? Who says I'm willing? Vivian said. He blinked. I'm talking to you, she said. That's different from willing in the way you mean. I've been talking to rooms like this one my entire career. Rooms full of people who are very comfortable with the distance between their stated values and their actual patterns. I talk to them because the alternative is leaving the rooms to themselves. And rooms left to themselves tend to stay exactly the same. Ashford sat with this. What do? He said slowly. With 40 years of decisions you can't take back. You don't take them back, Vivian said. You can't. You start with today. You do the next thing differently, and you accept that the only evidence anyone should trust about who you're becoming is what you actually do next, not what you say about it. That's a very long road. Yes, she said, it is. He looked at her. The look of a man who has been in a lot of rooms and just understood something about all of them. When you land in Chicago, he said carefully, if you're open to it, I'd like to have a conversation. A real one. Not an apology, because I think you're right that apologies at this point are mostly for the comfort of the person giving them. He paused. About what private capital might look like if it were actually designed to be equitable. Not marketed as equitable, actually designed. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Send me your card, she said. He reached into his coat, produced one, held it out. She took it, looked at it briefly, put it in the tote without further and understood this was not yes. It was not no. It was the card accepted and the decision pending on the basis of what he did next, which was the only reasonable basis for any decision about any person. He sat back down. From 1D, Harriet Dunmore leaned slightly forward, the lean of someone who has been working up to something for long enough that the working up has become more tiring than the thing itself. Dr. Okafor, she said. Vivian looked at her. I want to ask you something. Harriet's voice had the texture of 71 years in it. Not frailty. Something more like density. The compression of a lot of life into a register that had gotten quieter over time without getting smaller. And I want you to know that I understand if the answer is that it's none of my business. Ask, Vivian said. Harriet looked at her hands, then back up. Were you afraid at any point this morning? Were you afraid? The cabin did not go quiet. It was already quiet. But something in the air shifted, the quality of a question that several people had wanted to ask and hadn't found the form for. Vivian considered it honestly. Not for forming consideration, actually taking the time. Not afraid, she said. Tired, Harriet waited. There's a kind of tired that isn't about this morning, Vivian said. It's not about this flight or this crew or these 43 minutes. It's about 40 years of mornings like this one, different rooms, different instruments, same architecture. She paused. Every time I walk into a space that wasn't built with me in mind, I have to decide, am I going to express myself or am I going to hold my ground? And making that decision over and over across 40 years, that's what's tiring. Not any one room, the accumulation of all of them. Harriet was quiet for a moment. My husband flew this route, she said, for 38 years. He told me once that the hardest thing about his career wasn't the flying. It was earning the right to fly. Every time he walked into a new assignment, a new crew, a new destination, he had to prove it again, that he belonged in the cockpit, that the certification meant what it said it meant. She paused. He was very good at the flying. He was also very tired. I know, Vivian said. That kind of tired. I should have said something this morning, Harriet said. At the beginning. When Sandra first came to your row and I saw the look on her face and I knew what it was. She said it plainly. Without the protective layer of I didn't understand or I wasn't sure. I knew. And I said nothing because I didn't want the trouble. And I have been sitting here for the last 30 minutes thinking about what it means that I let my comfort be more important than your dignity. It means you're human, Vivian said. That feels like too easy an answer. It's not an absolution, Vivian said. It's just accurate. You're human. Humans make calculations about when to spend their comfort and when to protect it. The question is whether you make a different calculation next time. Harriet looked at her. Is there a next time? At 71? There's always a next time, Vivian said. For as long as you're in rooms with other people, which if you're doing it right is every day. Something in Harriet's face moved, not crying. The precursor to sometimes resolves differently into something more like clarity. The expression is friend of someone arriving at a destination they hadn't known they were traveling toward. My husband died 4 years ago, Harriet said, not as explanation, as connection. Offering it the way you offer something when you recognize it in someone else. Vivian was quiet for a moment. 4 years for me too, she said. Harriet looked at her, the look of two women at a specific distance from the same kind of loss, recognizing each other across 8 inches of airplane aisle. Does it? Harriet started. Not easier, Vivian said. Different. It becomes different. Harriet nodded slowly. The nod of someone who needed to hear that and hadn't known they needed to hear it until it was said. They were quiet together for a moment, the particular quality of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. Then Harriet reached across the aisle. Not far. Just enough. Her hand extended in the narrow space between their rows. Old hand. Careful. The hand of someone who had spent a long time not touching things she wasn't sure she had the right to touch. Vivian looked at it, then reached across. Took Harriet's hand. Briefly. Just a moment. The specific warmth of two women at altitude who had understood something together that they hadn't understood alone. Then released it. And both of them looked at the window. At the tarmac beginning to move as the aircraft pushed back. At the ground crew and the orange vests and the machinery of departure going about its work with the impersonal precision of systems that didn't care what had happened in the cabin above them. From 3B, Catalina Voss put down her pen. She'd been writing through all of it, through Ashford and Price and Sansra and now Harriet. She had 14 pages of notes. Detailed, time-stamped in the margin where she could remember the sequence. Quotes with attribution, observations flagged for follow-up, the structural shape of what happened beginning to resolve itself in her mind into the form of something that could be told to people who hadn't been in the room. She looked at seat 2A, at the back of Vivian's head against the window. She had been working on the aviation discrimination piece for 7 months. 3 sources, a legal framework, data from 11 airlines, a narrative structure that worked technically but hadn't yet found its center. She found it now. In a question she hadn't heard until 40 minutes ago, in a cabin she hadn't expected to be a case study. What would you have done if she was nobody? She closed the notebook, tucked the pen in the spiral, and sat back for the first time since boarding. The plane was moving. The gate was receding. The terminal was getting smaller through the window. The other gates and their jetways and the morning foot traffic of a city airport getting back to the business of moving people from one place to another. From 4C, Abernathy opened his book again. Actually read it this time. The particular quality of reading, that meant he had said what needed saying and the room had heard it, and the rest of it was someone else's work. Now, Reginald Ashford looked at his window, at the city beyond the airport. At Chicago from the ground, which was different from Chicago at altitude in ways that weren't only physical. Sandra Pruitt in the galley began her pre-takeoff cabin check, moving through the routine of her job with the automatic precision of someone who had done it several thousand times. Tray tables up. Seatbacks forward, safety card out. She moved through the cabin the way you move through something familiar when the familiar has just shifted underneath you and you're still learning what the new ground feels like. She reached row 2, paused, looked at Vivian who was looking at the window at the airport moving past, at the tail of the plane which wasn't visible from inside, but she knew where it was. Sandra opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Dr. Okafor. Vivian looked at her. Thank you, Sandra said. For the job, for what you told Marsh. She paused. I know I don't deserve it. No, Vivian said, simply. Not yet. Sandra absorbed this, but you could earn it. Vivian said, that's the point. If you do the work, if you actually sit in this room, you could earn it. Sandra nodded. Moved on. The plane turned onto the taxiway. The hum of the engines shifted register. Outside, the runway extended ahead of them, gray and long and ordinary in the way of all runways, which were just strips of built ground that made something extraordinary possible. Vivian looked at her notebook, opened it to the clean page she'd started writing on while Whitfield was making his calls. Reads what she'd written. Then wrote one more line at the bottom, looked at it, closed the notebook, put it in the tote. And when the engines pushed and the plane began its run and the ground fell away beneath them and Chicago opened up below like a map of itself, Vivian Okafor looked out the window at the city receding and felt something she hadn't expected to feel at 7:52 on a Tuesday morning in January. Not victory, not indication, not the specific satisfaction of having been right, which was a small and temporary thing compared to what she actually felt. She felt the beginning of some, not her beginning. She had begun a long time ago in a kitchen at midnight with a man who understood something about rooms that tried to make you smaller. Not the airlines beginning, though. They were going to begin something today, whether they were ready to or not. The beginning of the next version of this conversation. The version that would happen in training rooms and boardrooms and contract negotiations and policy documents. The version that would have Marsh's name on it and Skybridge's legal department's name on it, and eventually, if the work got done the way work had to get done to actually matter, the version that would have no particular name on it at all. That would just be the way things were done. The new architecture. The standard that had been built because someone stayed in her seat on a Tuesday morning and held her ground until the room had to look at itself. That beginning, that was what she felt. Below them, Chicago was already small. The grid of streets, the geometry of a city built by hands and arguments and decisions and compromise. The particular gray-white of winter sky above it. And somewhere in that city at 2 o'clock this afternoon, a building was going to have a name carved on it in stone. She was going to stand at a podium and say the right words. And this time, she realized she wasn't going to do it alone in the way she'd been afraid of this morning. She was going to do it carrying everything that had happened in the last hour, carrying Whitfield's 30 years and the first officer he'd been asked to step aside, carrying Harriet's hand across the aisle, carrying Abernathy's careful witness and Price's honest accounting of himself, and even Sandra's one true thing, I don't know what I would have done. That's the worst part. She was going to stand at that podium carrying all of it, and that felt right. That felt like exactly what Robert would have wanted, because he had always said, and she had not fully understood it until this morning, until this particular version of the room that had tried to make her smaller, that the building wasn't the point.
Just the evidence.
The point was what you built getting there. The clouds swallowed Chicago. One moment the city was there, the grid, the lakefront, the particular geometry of a place built by argument and compromise and hands that had never met each other. And then the overcast took it the way weather takes everything eventually, without ceremony or announcement. Gone. Vivian watched the white close over. The cabin had reached its cruising altitude of human tension, which was lower than before. Not resolved, but different. The difference between a room where something has just happened and a room where something has happened, and the people in it are now deciding what they are going to do with having been there. People had gone back to their screens, their books, the ordinary performance of transit that passengers engage in after something extraordinary because the alternative is sitting with the extraordinary without anything to hold on to. Sandra moved through that cabin with water. Not the cart, just a tray. The routine restored to something like its functional self, if not its original one. She'd been the galley since the plane's plane leveled off, doing the small procedural tasks of her job with the focused attention of someone who needed the familiar right now. The routine as anchor, as the thing that said, you still know how to do this, even if today changed what this means. She reached row 2. Stopped. Looked at Vivian, who was looking at her notebook. Not writing. Just looking at what she'd written, the way you look at a thing you made to see whether it still means what you meant it to mean. Stillwater, Sandra said. I thought you hadn't had anything since you boarded. Vivian looked up at the glass, then at Sandra. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, that was out, that required more time and more work than 43 minutes, and a phone call to Marsh could produce. But something, the acknowledgement of a beginning. The recognition that this was not the end of anything but the difficult opening of something else. Something that would require both of them to be in it over time with no clean conclusion but with direction. That was enough. For now, that was enough. Vivian took the glass. Thank you, Sandra. Sandra moved on. And the way she moved was different from the way she'd moved through this cabin 2 hours ago. Not dramatically different, not transformed, but shifted in the small specific ways that real shifts always are. A degree or two off the original heading. Enough, over distance, to end up somewhere else entirely. From 4C, Abernathy was reading. Actually reading, the quality of it different from the performance of reading he'd maintained through the early part of the flight. The book was open, and his eyes were moving, and he was somewhere inside it, which meant he'd said what's needed saying and was now allowing the room to do the rest of its work without him. From 3B, Catalina Voss had her tray table down and was writing in the long, uninterrupted lines of someone who has found the shape of a thing and is moving fast to capture it before the shape shifts. 14 pages of notes behind her. The center of the piece she'd been trying to find for 7 months, sitting now in a seat on a Tuesday morning in a sentence she hadn't written yet, but could feel the weight of. From 1C, Reginald Ashford was looking at his window, at the clouds. The particular white that altitude makes of weather, clean from a distance, complicated up close like most things. He had his phone in his hand, not recording, not calling, just holding it the way people hold things they're not sure they've been using correctly. From 1D, Harriet Dunmore was looking at her own hands, but differently from before. Not the avoidance of earlier, not the studied non-seeing of someone trying to not know something they knew. This was something else, the looking of someone sitting at which they finally decided to take seriously. The engines maintained their the recycled air moved through its filters. The instruments in the cockpit, Whitfield's instruments in Whitfield's cockpit on Vivian's plane, registered everything that needed registering. Vivian opened her notebook to the clean page. The one she'd been building something since they'd left the gate. Read what was there. Then turned to a fresh page and began writing in earnest, the long, specific, structural writing of someone designing a thing rather than describing one. A training program, not a module, not a checklist. The real shape of a room where people had to sit with something long enough to actually examine it, rather than perform having examined it. The curriculum of discomfort, built by someone who had spent 62 years understanding discomfort from the inside. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. Catalina Voss reached the front of her notebook, all 14 pages. She turned back to the first one, read from the beginning. The notes from boarding, Sandra's first approach to seat 2A, the comment to Marcus, the angle of it. Bassett's language about booking irregularities, the way he'd said forged documentation without looking away. Abernathy's intervention, Price's procedural counter, Whitfield's face when he came out of the cockpit and looked at the room, and Vivian. Through all of it, the specific quality of stillness that Catalina had been trying to name since she sat down in 3B and realized she was watching something. She had it now. It wasn't patience. Patience implied waiting for something to change. This was different. This was the stillness of someone who had already decided what was true and was waiting for the room to catch up. Who wasn't managing the situation so much as allowing it to resolve at the speed it needed to resolve, because she knew, from experience, from 40 years of rooms, that the truth had a pace, and forcing it produced confession rather than understanding. Catalina wrote that down, flagged it. The center of the piece, she looked at seat 2A. The woman in it was writing. Had been writing for most of the last 40 minutes. Not emails, not messages. The physical, committed writing of someone building something on paper, because paper had a permanence that screens didn't. Catalina had two choices. She could wait until they landed and contact Vivian through the company website, which was the professional thing to do, the thing that respected the separation between a person's private flight and their public accountability. Or she could say something now in this cabin where she had 14 pages of the story she'd been trying to write for 6 months and where the person who had lived it was 3 rows as she chose, stood, moved forward, stopped at row 2. Dr. Okafor, I'm sorry to interrupt. Vivian looked up. Catalina Voss. I write about transportation, infrastructure, and civil rights law. I've been working on a piece about discrimination in commercial aviation for 7 months. She said it directly, no preamble, no qualification. I've been taking notes since before Mr. Bassett arrived.
I know, Vivian said.
I noticed you when you sat down. Catalina blinked. The notebook, Vivian said. The way you were holding it, you weren't writing for yourself. No, Catalina said. I wasn't. A pause. I'd like to speak with you, on the record, about the broader pattern, not only today, but the architecture of today. What produces a situation like this? What sustains it? What would actually change it? Vivian looked at her for a moment. My assistant's contact information is on the company website, she said. Read this week, before Friday. Catalina nodded. She started to turn back to her seat, then stopped. "One more thing," she said. "The question you asked, about what they would have done if you were nobody." She paused. "I've been looking for the center of this feast for 7 months. That's it. That question is it." Vivian held her gaze. "Then write it well, Cass." Catalina went back to 3B, sat down, opened her notebook to a new page, wrote the title of the piece at the top. For the first time in 7 months, it was the right one. From 4C, Abernathy set his book down, looked at seat 2A with the expression of a man confirming something. "Dr. Okafor," he said. "Noel Abernathy. I teach civil rights law. I want you to know that what occurred on this aircraft this morning constitutes textbook public accommodation discrimination under Title II. Use of witnesses. Documentation." A journalist with contemporaneous notes. He paused. "You have a case if you want one." "I know," Vivian said. "Are you going to pursue it?" She looked at the notebook in her lap, at the structure she'd been building for the last 40 minutes. "I'm going to do something that takes longer and produces more," she said. "A lawsuit gets you a settlement, a headline, a policy document that lives in a drawer for 2 years before the next incident." She paused. "I want something that changes what people do when nobody's watching, when there's no journalist in 3B, when the passenger in 2A doesn't own the plane." Abernathy looked at her with the expression of a man who has argued things into existence for 22 years and recognizes the particular quality of an argument that has already decided it's going to win. "That's harder," he said. "Most things that matter are." He picked up his book. "If you need someone to speak to the legal framework," he said from behind the open cover, "about what the law actually requires and what this morning actually constituted, I'm available, not as a favor, as someone who should have been doing more of that work outside courtrooms." He went back to reading, and Vivian went back to writing. The plane moved through the night sky. The engines maintained their steady conversation with the air. Below the overcast, somewhere, Chicago was already an hour behind them. The wheels touched down. The way wheels always touch down, the thud, the deceleration, the particular sound of a machine coming back into contact with the earth it was built to leave. Reverse thrust, runway lights, the ordinary infrastructure of arrival moving past the windows. They taxied. The cabin began its landing performance, phones emerging from airplane mode, seat belts clicking open ahead of the sign. The sounds of people preparing to be somewhere else, to be done with the being here and the things that had happened here and the questions as those things had left behind. Vivian stayed. She always stayed seated until the plane was fully stopped. Not a rule, a habit. The habit of someone who had learned that the destination would still be there in 2 more minutes and that the urgency of the aisle rush had never once produced a meaningfully different outcome. She looked at the notebook, closed it, put it in the tote. The plane stopped. The door opened. The jetway connected with its mechanical groan of infrastructure meeting infrastructure. Row 1 moved first. Reginald Ashford stood, gathered his coat, his bag. "Look at Vivian, Dr. Okafor." He reached into his coat, produced a card, extended it. "I meant what I says. You're ready. If you're ever ready." She took it, looked at it briefly, put it in the tote. He understood what that meant. Not yes, not no. Evidence pending. The only reasonable basis. He nodded, moved to the aisle. Harriet Dunmore stood more slowly. The careful physicality of someone who had learned to negotiate with your body's new requirements. She had her coat and her bag and the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere further than the destination on her boarding pass. She stopped at row 2. "Dr. Okafor," she said, "I'm going to write you a letter." Vivian looked at her. "Not an apology," Harriet said. "You were right that apologies at this point are mostly for the person giving them. A letter." She paused. "I'm going to write down what I've been thinking about since you asked that question. And when I'm sure I understand what I actually think, when I've sat with it long enough to know the honest answer, and not just the answer that makes me feel better about this morning, I'll send it." "I'll read it," Vivian said. Harriet held her gaze for one more moment, then moved to the aisle. Abernathy passed row 2, paused. "2 things, he said. First, you handled it this morning better than I have, and I'm a professional. What's the second thing?" "The woman in 3B. He glanced back at Catalina, who was moving up the aisle with her bag over one shoulder and her notebook already open to a page she was rereading as she walked. "Whatever she's writing, it's going to be the documentation that makes your proposal enforceable. I've read her work on the Houston Transit case. Let her write it." "I noticed her an hour before you did," Vivian said. Abernathy smiled. The small smile of a man recognizing a quality he respected in someone else. "Of course you did," he said. He moved toward the door. Catalina reached row 2. Stopped. "Before Friday," she said. "Before Friday," Vivian confirmed. Catalina went. The cabin was nearly empty now. Bassett had left during deplaning, not dramatically, not with anything said, just the quiet exit of a man who had used up everything he had available to say and needed to go somewhere and think about what came next. The other passengers had filed out with the polite efficiency of people who had witnessed something significant and were now processing it privately, in the way that significant things get sist. Slowly, over days, in the middle of other things, arriving at conclusions when you weren't expecting to. Sandra appeared at the front of the cabin, without the cart, without the professional reason, just Sandra in her navy and silver uniform, and standing at the threshold of the empty first-class section, looking at seat 2A, where Vivian was still sitting, the only one left. Sandra walked forward, all the way to row 2, stood in the aisle, no cart. No professional reason, just Sandra in her navy and silver uniform, standing at the threshold of the empty first-class section, looking at seat 2A, where Vivian was still sitting, the only one left. Everyone's off, Sandra said. I know, Vivian said, I'll be right behind you. But you're the moved. 13 years, Sandra said. I've thought for most of them that I was good at this job, that I saw people. She stopped. I had a picture in my head of who was supposed to be where, and I never once looked at the picture and asked where it came from. I just used it, like it was the same as a fact. That's what pictures like that do, Vivian said. They feel like facts because you've never had reason to question them. Because the people who might have told you differently were too busy managing the consequences of the picture to have the conversation about it. Is that what today was? Me being managed? No, Vivian said. Today was the conversation. It's just 40 years late. Sandra was quiet. I keep thinking about what you said to Marsh, she said. That you wanted me to keep the job. Why? After everything this morning, why does that serve you? It doesn't serve me, Vivian said. It serves the next woman who sits in this seat, who doesn't own the plane, who can't call Director Marsh, who has a valid ticket and nowhere extraordinary to be and needs the person in the uniform to actually see her. Sandra looked at the window, at the jetway, at the small strip of Chicago winter sky at the edge of it. The training, she said, the real training, in a room. She paused. I don't know what I'm going to find out about myself in there. I don't know if I'm going to like it. You probably won't, Vivian said. The second day is the hardest. They ask you to name a time your assumptions caused real harm to someone else, not a small assumption. A real one with real consequences. And you have to find it and say it out loud. What if I can't find it? You can always find it, Vivian said. The work is admitting that you found it. Sandra stood with this. Okay, she said. The single syllable of someone who has made a decision they're going to have to keep making every day going forward. Okay, Vivian said back, a witness to the beginning. Safe travels, Dr. Okafor. Take care of yourself, Sandra. Sandra went to the galley. Vivian stood, picked up the canvas tote, walked to the front of the cabin, paused at the door, turned back. One last look at seat 2A, the window, the sliver of Chicago winter sky at the edge of the jetway, second row window, left side the seat Robert chose when they first designed the configuration for this aircraft. Sitting at their kitchen table with the leasing documents and a pot of coffee that went cold before they were done. Second row window, left side, he'd said, so you can see where you're going. She had thought that was sentimental at the time. She no longer thought that. She turned, walked up the jetway. The terminal fleet received her the way terminals always do, without ceremony. Just the noise and light and organized chaos of O'Hare at 11 in the morning, indifferent to what anyone was carrying through its corridors. She walked until the noise dropped, found a seat near a window slightly back from the main flow, the kind of spot that exists in every large airport for people who need a moment before the next thing.
She called to Zayazi.
He answered on the second ring. Mom, you landed, I landed. How was it? She looked out at the tarmac, at the planes in their orderly patterns. The orange vests, the machinery of something that only worked when everyone did their part correctly. Eventful, she said. Good eventful or bad eventful? She thought about seat 2A and Sandra's one true thing and Whitfield's 30 years and Harriet's hand across the aisle and Abernathy's closed book and Ashford putting his phone face down. Both, she said. I'll tell you everything tonight. You okay? She watched a plane push back from its gate, the beginning of its own journey. I'm better than okay, she said, and meant it. 6 months later, the check the man with the kind eyes had pushed across the table was still uncashed. In its envelope, in a file. Some things you kept as evidence of what people thought your dignity was worth. Not to be angry about. Just to remember the distance between their accounting and yours. Skybridge Airlines implemented new passenger verification procedures in March. Supervisor authorization required. before any passenger could be asked to verify documentation beyond an initial boarding pass check. Written reason, consistent application, logged and audited quarterly. Not a revolution, a requirement. The kind of change designed to prevent the thing that made headlines rather than generate them. Sandra Pruitt completed the training in April, 3 days in Atlanta. The second day was the hardest. She sat with the assignment, name a time your assumptions caused real harm, for 3 hours, found it eventually. Not from this year, from 11 years ago. A passenger she barely remembered. She said it out loud, in a room with strangers, and the saying of it changed something in her that had been smooth and unexamined for a long time. She went back to the first-class cabin 6 weeks later, stood in the galley before boarding, hands as a counter, breathing. This is different now, not because the room is different, because I'm trying to be, which isn't the same thing yet, but it's where it starts. Catalina Voss published in May, a long-form investigation, 3 airlines, 11 documented cases, the full account of flight SK-11247 with every participant who agreed to be named correctly. The center of it was the question. The title was that sentence. Nothing else. It received more shares in its first week than anything Catalina had written in 7 years, not from general readers, but from inside the industry. People who had been watching the same pattern from different positions and were reading the piece the way you read something that gives shape to what you already knew but couldn't say. 3 airlines contacted her within 10 days, not to dispute, to ask about the protocol. Abernathy added the case to his syllabus. Premium cab in January. Taught it in the second week before the statutes, because the legal framework made more sense when you'd first spent time inside the human situation it addressed. His students argued about Sandra every semester. He never resolved it for them. Some arguments needed to stay alive to do their work. Ashford sent a proposal in June, not a donation, a structure. A small fund for working capital to aviation and adjacent businesses whose founders had been declined by conventional financing for reasons Ashford was now prepared to name correctly. Vivian read it twice, had 3 conversations with him, co-chaired the advisory board on the condition the metrics were public, quarterly, reviewable by anyone. He agreed without negotiating. Harriet sent a letter in July, on paper, in careful cursive. Not an apology. She had decided those arrived too late to be worth much to the receiver. A letter about her granddaughter. 17, wanted to be a pilot. I'm going to make sure she knows your name, Harriet wrote. Not so she can be grateful. So she knows what it looks like to hold your ground in a room that wants you to leave. I think that's more useful than gratitude. And at the bottom, smaller, I've been thinking about your question every day since January. The honest answer is, I was afraid, not of trouble. Afraid that speaking up would change something about my position in the room. I'm working on it. Vivian read it twice, put it in the box. 3rd shelf, behind the tax documents. Next to the envelope with Robert's handwriting. She stood at the podium at 2 o'clock on that January Tuesday. Robert's name carved in stone behind her. Chicago winter in the air. Isaiah in the front row. Coat buttoned wrong. Eyes is already bright. She put her notes aside. Robert used to say that real power didn't need a costume, she began. He learned that over a long time. Through rooms that wanted him to perform a version of himself that would make other people comfortable. And then one day he stopped. Not because the rooms changed, because he understood that performing for the room's expectations was the same as agreeing they were the standard. And they weren't. His were. She paused. This morning's I was on a plane. Someone looked at me and decided I didn't belong in the seat I was sitting in. And I stayed in the seat. Because Robert spent 20 years making sure I understood. When a room tries to make you smaller, you don't comply. You hold your ground. You let the truth arrive. The crowd was still. He would have been embarrassed by this building, she said. He hated ceremonies. He would have said it was too much. Could we please just go get dinner? A small laugh moved through the crowd, but he would have liked what it's for. A center for people who build the things the world needs without waiting for permission, who stay in rooms that want them to leave, who hold their ground and let the truth arrive in its own time. She looked at his name in the stone. I'm going to keep building things, she said, in his name and in my own. And I'm going to keep sitting in the seat I'm entitled to sit in. And I'm going to ask everyone in every room I enter to do the same, to see the people in front of them, not the picture in their heads, not the expectation. She let us sit, the people, she said. Just the people. After, she stood with Isaiah outside. The snow had committed, light, settling on the carved letters with the indifference of weather that didn't know whose name it was landing on. He had his arm around her shoulders, taller than Robert. Different build, the same quality of being entirely where he was. Your coat, she said. Third button from the top. You skipped the second, he laughed. The real kind, the unburdened kind. They stood in the snow in front of the name. Tell me about the flight, he said. She looked up at the planes on their approach paths, descending through the snow toward the runways, the machinery of aviation doing what it did regardless of weather. Regardless of what had happened in any particular cabin on any particular morning. It was a good flight, she said, eventually. That's not the whole story. No, see, she said, but it's the true part. The rest is a conversation for dinner, a long one. Ma? He pulled her slightly closer. I'm already sitting down, he said, metaphorically. Then you're ready, she said, and she told him. Not all of it at once. Some things require more than one conversation to hold properly. But the shape of it, the boarding pass, and the director and the captain who had been a first officer who had been asked to step aside. The woman in 1D who had known from the first minute and looked at her lap. The banker who put his phone face down. The journalist with 14 pages. The security officer who named his own failure out loud. And Sandra, the one true thing Sandra had finally said. Isaiah listened completely, without filling the pauses. When she finished, they were quiet. Dad Sad would have had something to say about all of it, he said. He always did. What do you think he would have said? She looked at the building, at the name, at the snow settling on the carved letters. He would have said, good, she said, and then he would have asked if anyone had eaten anything. Isaiah laughed, full and real and relieved. He really would have, he said. He really would have, she agreed. The snow came down on the building and the city and the planes and the two of them. And somewhere above the overcast, on its next flight and the one after that, Calcephin Meridian was doing what it had been built to do, carrying people forward.